have wrapped up Christmas and approaching the new year. It's exciting to be in this holiday season, and I have this special device here which I would like to use during the sermon. So just wait for it because we will need it a little bit later. As you probably imagine, one of the things we will be talking about today is weights or scales or something like this, because there are different types of weights or different types of scales. Probably that's the right thing I wanted to mention here. And as you drive on a highway, you probably noticed there are sometimes you can see signs that there is a weigh station, right? A weighing station where, for example, semi-trucks or big trucks need to kind of divert a little bit and go through the scales, and they are being measured or they've been weighed to understand whether they can go on this road, whether they have an overload, whether they violate the rules, and things like that. So it's important. And that's probably a little bit different type of scales that we have here. And this is probably a little bit of an ancient type of scales that we have here. And just to demonstrate that there are different types of things. So as we are approaching the new year, you guys probably notice that a lot of people do New Year resolutions. And people just make some sort of commitments for the next year, for the next period. I have a confession to make. I have a gym subscription. I used to go to a gym for some time, and unfortunately, recently I kind of stopped going there. But when I was going to gym, I noticed that usually beginning of January, there was considerably more people coming or going to gym rather than during the rest of the year, during the rest of the time. And usually, you would come to you would go to the gym and you would see that there are not so many people. But in January, it's significantly more than in February. It's a little bit less people going. In March, even less. April, even less. And May would be like as usual. Those regular people who regularly go to gym. So people sometimes make commitments or resolutions, and they unfortunately don't follow through on those commitments. And that's important for us to understand that sometimes it is time for us just to stop, to weigh our lives, to test our lives, to evaluate our lives, and see where we are. Because usually, because from time to time we have to do this. And Bible actually tells us about the same. We will read one interesting story from the book of Daniel, and we will read about God's scales, actually. It's an interesting story about King Belshazzar, who was the ruler of the empire of the time, and that was the Assyrian Empire. And we will read from the book of Daniel, chapter 5. We will read not the entire chapter, but we will read quite a bit. So we will start with verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the thousands. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And this is because he had conquered Jerusalem. He had conquered Judea and Israel, right? So, and the king and his lord, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. And then we'll continue from verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. And you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hands is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So that's an interesting story. We didn't read it entirely, but we read the most important part of it. And I hope most of the present people here know the story very well, and you probably have read it multiple times in the Bible. So I don't want to go into more detail given the background. I will just point a few historical things because and just to give us bigger, context of what happened here. So this king, actually, his father Nebuchadnezzar, he conquered Jerusalem, he conquered Judea, he conquered Israel, and he brought them captive into Chaldea, into the land where they were. And his son, or according to some other versions, his grandson, because he was actually the second ruler, but he was the son of his daughter, of Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So Belshazzar was his, at least as a minimum, his very close relative. So he knew everything that happened with Nebuchadnezzar. He knew the history. And because everything was conquered, Israel was conquered, those precious vessels and all the holy vessels and different things from the temple, they were brought to Chaldea, to Babylon, and basically they stayed there in their country. And when they had this feast, he decided to bring them in to drink from them along with, his king, his lords and his wives and so on. And basically in this way to demonstrate how powerful he was. So God sent his judgment. God sent the hand that wrote this on the wall. And the words that we read are clearly Aramaic. They describe a sequence of weights, decreasing from a mina to a shekel to a half shekel. And it's interesting, right? So it goes from the bigger weight to a smaller weight. And if you read these words as verbs, the sequence becomes numbered, weighed, and divided. That's if you literally read these words. And excuse me, the Lord has numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end because he had judged and found him lacking. So that kind of was the reason for that inscription. And interesting that Daniel didn't offer us too much in his book of the historical background, because I believe he was focusing on the divine judgment, not on the historical facts. But there are two ancient historians who wrote about those events. This is Herodotus and Xenophon. They both independently wrote that Babylon was taken during a festival by means of a temporary diversion of the river Euphrates. So the invaders who did the siege of the city at the time, they did the diversion of the river again. This is according to those historians, meaning that they had a very interesting plan because the city was very mighty. The walls were so wide that historians say that two chariots can go on a wall and they could bypass each other. That's how thick the walls were. So the king, it looks like they had this festival during the time when the city had enemies around it, when the city was in a siege, was besieged. And they didn't care much about this. He was drinking, he was eating with his lords, with his wives, with his friends. He did a big feast, and all of this happening while he has the army of enemies around the city. But the enemies had a very cunning plan, and they decided to secretly divert the river, which was a very mighty, very big river, and it flew through the city. So in order to conquer the city, they decided to use the bed of the river, which the water was diverted, and they went into the city through the riverbed and were able to capture it. This is what happened kind of as the historical background. And Xenophon actually also records that the Persians killed, as he wrote, the young, irreligious Babylonian king. He called him irreligious, meaning that he didn't really care about gods. He didn't really care about worshiping those gods that they had. And this is exactly what we see here. He didn't sought the mighty God, and he didn't care about the gods they had, those idols they had as their nation. And it is time, looking at the story, we can see that it is time to weigh and check our lives. Friends, we can take this time, considering that we're approaching the end of the year, we're about to start in another year, it is time to check and weigh our lives. And why? Why would we do this? Because on the story of Belshazzar, we can see that God does three things with our lives. It's not something that he does only with Belshazzar, or he did to Belshazzar. He does it pretty much with the entire humanity, with the entire world. And those are three things. The first thing is what God does is God numbers. God numbers. And this is the word Mene in this inscription. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. God is sovereign over time and life. He counts the days, times, moments, and opportunities we have. Belshazzar's reign had been numbered and was now at its conclusion. And the interesting point, like I mentioned before, is that the weights the weights that God said, they were going from bigger to smaller weights. And maybe God looked at the king's life and he noticed that he started good, maybe. He started somewhere good, and he went to worse and worse and worse. And maybe when we look back, what do we see? Are we going from small to big things in front of God? Or we go from big things to small, or we go from good to bad things in front of God? Not in our own eyes, but how does it look like in God's eyes? Do we look the same as King Belshazzar looked, or we look differently? You can evaluate, you can take this time to evaluate your spiritual life. Are you in a better place in your relationship with God than you were, let's say, last year? Are you in better relationship with God than you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Look at how you do in front of God. Look through God's eyes, if possible, and see and evaluate yourself. Psalm 90:12 says has a very interesting expression. The psalmist says, "Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart to wisdom." He says, teach us to number our days, so that not only God numbers our days, but we can number our own days. What does it mean? It means that he's asking God, please teach us to observe the way we live, the way I live, so that I can gain a heart to wisdom. It is important to realize, and I think probably most of us, we do realize, but it's somewhere in the back of our mind, we realize that our days are finite. That it means that our days are counted. We have some certain period of time on the earth. We don't know what period that is, but it is finite. God has already numbered it. God knows it. We don't know it. And it is important that we should use them to wisely fulfill God's purposes. I encourage you to reflect on the subject and put more time to think about that and think that each moment matters. Each moment of our life matters. I remember I was talking to a guy who likes watching movies, and he says that, there are some movies I can watch 3 times because I like them, and it's an interesting movie. I can watch it 3 times, or I can rewatch it even 4 times. It's interesting. I'm like, really? You would sit on a couch for 2 hours to watch something, and then you would sit another 2 hours to watch it again and again. That's a huge waste of time. What are you doing? Every moment matters. And a lot of people just burn through their time. They just don't realize that every moment matters. Steve Jobs, probably everyone knows who Steve Jobs is, especially those who carry iPhones. You guys should know. I do not, by the way. But anyways, when he was diagnosed with cancer, when he realized that his days are numbered and he faced terminal illness, he said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life." This is what this person realized. And probably before being diagnosed with those things, I think he had different plans. I think he had other plans for his life, but when he heard the diagnosis those doctors gave him, he realized that no, life is changing. And he said that it's the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. I would hope he was thinking about God, but we don't know about that. He might be thinking about the meaning of life and what way he would come to Lord, in which condition he would come in front of the Lord. Are we spending our days pursuing God's will, or we are spending our days pursuing our selfish desires? What are we doing with our life? Is God's will at the center of our life, or it is kicked to the curb? And it's somewhere like we are pursuing our own will, our own goals, and God is somewhere, in the back, or His will is somewhere in the back. We need to remember that our days are numbered, and it is time to weigh and test our lives. The second thing that God does with our life is God weighs. And this is the second word there, Tekel, as we read it. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Other translations say it, and found lacking. You were weighed on the scales and you were found wanting. The way how scales work is that there are two different places or two opposing things, and if the things on one plate would overweight the other one, it would lift up. It would go like this. It should go like this, right? So we don't have two plates here, but some other types of scales they do, and but the principle is pretty much the same. So you would put things here, and you would put something else here, and you would see if that overweights the other side, if it overweights this part. We can see that it does not. And this is sometimes what happens with our lives, because we put some things on the scales of our life, and we think that, well, that's heavy enough, that's good enough, but on God's scales, it appears it's not good enough. And it means that when God says that He weighs, it means that He examines our hearts and action. And the problem is, like we just saw, that sometimes, in most cases, people weigh themselves incorrectly. Friends, that's our problem. Our aim is broken. Our scales are broken. We weigh ourselves incorrectly. And the only way we can weigh us correctly is to come in front of God and compare how God weighs us comparing to how we weigh ourselves. And sometimes, we look at our things, at our actions, at our life, at things we've achieved, and it may seem pretty good, right? And it may be good until we come in front of God, and then God evaluates us. When we read these words that you are found lacking, you are found wanting, this is a warning against complacency in spiritual life. This is a huge warning for us, friends. What is complacency? Probably you heard this word before, and I heard it as well, so I decided to look it up in the dictionary. And the dictionary says that complacency is self-satisfaction, especially when accompanied by unawareness of actual dangers or deficiencies. Again, complacency is self-satisfaction, especially when accompanied by unawareness of actual dangers or deficiencies. When it comes to safety, complacency can be dangerous. Self-satisfaction, meaning that I look at my own things, at my own life or my own conditions, whatever else I have, and I'm okay with that. And usually this is because I'm just unaware of how bad things are or how serious things can be. My brother is a doctor, and one of his favorite expressions is that he says, there are no healthy people around us. There are no healthy people around us. He says there are only people who have not been examined enough. I hope you understand it, right? So he said that if we put you, under examination and we'll start doing tests, we can find something in you. And sometimes when we don't go through examination, we think that we're pretty healthy, we're doing pretty well. And then we go to the doctor, we go to, we do our blood work or do other tests, and we realize that things need to be changed. Our diet needs to be changed, or the way we live needs to change, and things like that. What God is weighing on His scales? He's weighing our faith, He's weighing obedience, He's weighing our walk in front of Him, He's weighing our love, our motives. His judgment is just and perfect because He's weighing us against His standards. He has the right scales because He is holy and His standards are holy. 1 Samuel 16:7 reads like this, "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Man looks on the outward appearance, but Lord looks on the heart." It is a sobering reminder that God has completely different scales and set of weights than those that are used by people. Living a life apart from God leads to imbalances on His scales. And if you look into professional sports, and you look at professional competitions like Olympics, for example, right? Those, World Games, you can see that as athletes are rigorously tested and weighted for qualifications. Every time, before they go to competition, they have been tested, they have been weighed to be able to, for the organizers of the competition, to make sure they qualify for the competition. And even small imbalances, even small things like using prohibited substances, or you probably heard about doping scandals. When people use those substances, they disqualify them despite their apparent success. And there is one really vivid story, really bright story of a doping scandal in the case of Lance Armstrong. I'm not sure if you heard this name. Have you heard this name before? Lance Armstrong. This is a world-renowned cyclist who actually won. He won Tour de France 7 times. This is the cycling competition, right? Like the world best competition, and it usually goes in. It happens in France. So he won it 7 years, 7 times. Every time, once in a year. And his legacy, his career was marred by one of the most infamous doping scandals in the sport's history. Armstrong was celebrated as a cycling legend and a cancer survivor who inspired millions with his Livestrong campaign. He did a campaign. His name is Armstrong, and the campaign was called Livestrong or Livestrong, basically because he survived cancer. For years, he denied allegations of doping and positioned himself as an advocate for clean sports. However, after a thorough investigation, it was revealed that Armstrong had been at the center of a highly sophisticated doping program. As the result, in 2012, Armstrong was stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles. He was banned for life from competitive cycling. His reputation and endorsement collapsed, and he faced legal battles costing millions. Why? Because he did something wrong. Armstrong's case is a powerful metaphor for being weighted and found lacking. Despite outward success, his actions were hidden, but the truth eventually came to light. God's scales are even more rigorous. Sometimes we see the success, but pursuit of success at the expense of integrity leads to inevitable judgment. And outward accomplishment, friends, cannot outweigh inner dishonesty. If we are dishonest internally, if we're not in the right condition in front of God, the outward success means nothing. It can outweigh it. It's still not good enough. I encourage you to weigh your heart on God's scales. How do we get on God's scales? How do we get on God's scales? We read the Bible, we pray, we dive into the scriptures, we let the light of God's word shine on our life and change it. And it is very important that we do it. You probably noticed, if you read Telegram and you follow our church channel, you probably noticed that there was a poll posted yesterday on our church channel. And we do it from time to time. And yesterday we did this poll, and we were trying to evaluate how many people would be interested to start a Bible reading plan beginning January 1st and read it through the year. You know, to read the Bible in 1 year, basically. And interesting enough that we can see that the responses are quite different. And I will read the response. The poll is still going on, so I will take a look at the live results right now. And we can see what we have there, right? So we have 25 people, actually 82 people responded so far, and we can see that it's, by the way, it's an anonymous poll, so you can be, you know, sure that your responses is confidential. We have 27% of those who responded who said that they usually read the Bible in 1 year. We have 33% of the people who said that they try to read Bible in 1 year, but they struggle, meaning that they drop off. Typically, they drop off during the year. We have 26% of respondents who said that they don't read Bible in 1 year, but they try to read it regularly. Maybe every day, maybe not every day, but there is some sort of a regular schedule. And we have 14% of responses who honestly confessed that they do not read the Bible regularly. And this is the reflection of how we weigh ourselves. This is a reflection how we may stand on God's scales, because we can use our own scales, but God's scales will tell us something different. It is time to weigh and test our lives. And the third thing that God does with our life is God judges. And this is the third word that we see in this inscription on the wall. And this is Paris, your kingdom. This is what Daniel said, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar's arrogance and defiance of God led to his downfall. That's what happened to Belshazzar. Interestingly, like I said, that Xenophon records that the Persians killed the young, irreligious Babylonian king. He didn't care about God. He didn't care about the living God. He didn't care about his own gods. And similarly, nations and individuals are accountable to God today, the same as those king was accountable to God. And God's judgment is final and just. God's judgment is certain. This is something that we should remember, that God's judgment is certain. No one will be able to escape it. Hebrews 9:27 says, it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. It is appointed unto men once to die, but after that, or after this, there is judgment. This underscores the inevitability of facing God. Interestingly, God's mercy precedes judgment. Usually before judgment comes, God gives warnings and opportunities to repent. Belshazzar had Daniel's testimony and the story of his father or his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar in front of him as the testimony. What happens if you don't honor the living God? And still he refused to do it. He still didn't want to worship God. Probably, you know, when we look at those empires like Babylon, like Roman Empire, like other empires, and even the Soviet Empire, you can see that corruptions led to collapse, showing that no kingdom or individual is above God's judgment. God speaks his judgment. We have very good examples in the Word of God of those who followed God's heart and they wanted to examine themselves. Psalm 139:23 reads like that. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This is what the psalmist said here. He said, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. Can you imagine saying this to God? Can you say this to God, friends? Can you kneel down, pray to God and say, "O God, search me and know my heart"? Probably you would not want to say this even to a cop who stopped you on the road, right? Even if you're sure that you don't have any issues with law, probably you do not want to do this. Imagine yourself saying this, like sitting in front, behind the wheel, like, search me, or cop. Probably you wouldn't do this, right? Because who knows what they can find in your car or on you or something else. I know a story where I think we have a couple more minutes, and I want to tell a story, a real story of from our life in Ukraine, and that was in the Soviet times. And for those of you who have no connection to Soviet Union, I will try to describe those details so you understand the context of what was happening there. So a pastor in Ukraine was driving in a car, and he had several sisters from the church because it was a small church. I know this pastor and I know some of those sisters, and actually one of those sisters told the story because she was in that car. So they went to visit a different church, and they were going back from another town. They were coming back home. They were driving this car. The pastor was behind the wheel, and there were 3 or 4 other sisters from the church in the car. So you can imagine that in the Soviet Union there were pretty much no rest areas along the way. So if you needed to go to the restroom, you basically would stop somewhere where you find a good place on the road. You wouldn't be fined for that. That's okay. People would do this all the time. And they basically, needed to make a stop for their natural needs. They asked the pastor to do this, and they were going at the time, they were going through cornfields. And corn was actually something that the Soviet Union was, big on, and they were trying to sell it to other countries and things like that. So there were checkpoints on the road where, the police or militia, they would stop cars, they would check to make sure that people don't stop and people don't pick corn. It's not like you pick. It didn't work like that. You couldn't take corn and take it with you. So they stopped on the road. Sisters went on one side. He went on a different side of the field, basically. And then after some time, they came back. He came back. They sat in the car and kept going. And almost, in a couple of kilometers, they had the checkpoint on the road. So the police stops them, and the policeman to him like, "Hey, we kind of have a procedure. Would you please open your trunk because we need to search the car?" And he's like, "I'm a pastor, and we're going from a church. You guys probably you won't find anything in my car. So would you please let us go?" And he's like, "Sir, we have a procedure, so I need to search your car. Would you please open the trunk?" So he opens the trunk, and surprisingly, there is corn in the trunk, those corn cobs in the trunk. And he lost his speech. How did it happen? What happened? And it appears that while he was gone, sisters came back faster to the car. They ripped a little bit of corn cobs, and they put it in the trunk, and they were waiting for him. They didn't tell him anything. So he was sure he was doing good. He was doing well. But on the police scales, he wasn't doing so well. It is terrifying to hear from God that you are being weighed, and you found lacking. wouldn't it be terrifying to hear these words? We need to be ready for His judgment. It's not like the police would judge us, the law here on the earth would judge us. It's God who will judge us when the time comes. And there are only two options. Either you are with God and you are part of the heavenly kingdom, or you are with the devil and you go to hell. And that's very unfortunate, but there are only two options that exist out there. And God's judgment is final, and there is no appeal process. If we go to, to court here in our country, we can appeal the decision that was made, but in front of God there is no appeal process because His judgment is final. It is terrifying to hear such words from God. Like I said, you have been weighed and you found lacking. So it is important to avoid this. Let's reflect on our own lives and make our own decisions. And there are three things we can do today. When we look at those words that were inscribed on the wall, Mene, our days are numbered. The life goes fast and does not belong to us. Something too important, something to take away today. The life goes fast and does not belong to us. So think more about eternal things rather than about these terrestrial things. Think about this. Tekel, we are weighed. God values other things than people do. This is what it means. So learn to see the world through God's eyes. Learn to see the world through God's eyes. And Paris, meaning divided, or the judgment was done, the judgment was carried out. For us, it means the judgment is coming. Test yourself to see where you aim. Test yourself to see where your life is going. Are we stewarding our days wisely? Are we going through our life in the right way? Interesting that before judgment, and this is something that's important for us to see, that before judgment comes, God gives the opportunities to change things. God gives opportunities to repent. And this is what He did with Jesus. Because Jesus and God in general didn't come on earth to judge people right away. He first came on the earth to save people, and this is why we celebrate Christmas. In other words, this is the first coming to the earth, God's first coming. But there will be a second coming, and the second time, as we read in the Bible, God will come to judge the earth. So God has given opportunities, multiple opportunities for people around the earth to listen to Him and to repent. And He gives this mercy. And whatever we would do, whatever we would try to do with our own efforts, with our own things, it's not correct. So if we do good things like this, if we do even more, and if I had even more skills, they wouldn't help. But then God steps in when we come to Him, and when He puts in His sacrifice for us, we can see that it overweights everything else. Because our own efforts is never good enough. It's not enough to forgive us. It's not enough to secure the place in front of God, to secure the place in the heavenly kingdom. But His sacrifice, with His sacrifice, He made us righteous. So today, it is time to evaluate ourselves. Today, it is time to make wise decisions. Today, it is time to count our days, to number our days, to evaluate our days, to evaluate our life, to test our life, and to see where we're going. Because the time is coming for God to come for the second time. And who knows when we meet Him, who knows where we will live through the day when He comes to the earth for the second time. I wish all of us have the right weight in front of God. This is what's important. So let's stand up and pray.